The strategic shock of the Yom Kippur War, launched on October 6, 1973, remains the most profound case study in the dangers of military hubris and the catastrophic failure of institutional intelligence. To analyze this conflict, one must first dismantle the Israeli concepcia, the dogmatic belief that reigned after the 1967 Six-Day War. This concept held that Egypt would never initiate a war until it possessed long-range strike aircraft to neutralize the Israeli Air Force and that Syria would only attack in tandem with Egypt. This intellectual trap allowed the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, to overlook the massive buildup of Egyptian and Syrian forces on their borders, interpreting the clear signs of an impending invasion as merely another round of seasonal maneuvers. The silence of the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, provided the perfect tactical cover for the joint Arab offensive. At 1400 hours, the Middle East exploded into a conflict that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of modern mechanized warfare, proving that even a technologically superior force can be brought to the brink of annihilation when its foundational assumptions are flawed. The Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal, codenamed Operation Badr, was an engineering and tactical masterpiece that bypassed the seemingly impregnable Bar-Lev line. This defensive chain of fortifications, built along the eastern bank of the canal, relied on massive sand ramparts that Israeli engineers believed would take days to breach with conventional explosives. However, the Egyptian Chief of Staff, Saad el-Shazli, utilized a remarkably simple yet ingenious solution: high-pressure water cannons purchased from West Germany and Great Britain. By pumping water directly from the canal, Egyptian engineering units blasted 60 openings in the sand walls in a matter of hours. This allowed 5 infantry divisions, supported by armored brigades, to flood across the waterway. The secret to their success was not just the breach, but the SAM umbrella, a dense network of Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, including the SA-2, SA-3, and the mobile SA-6 Gainful. For the first time, the Israeli Air Force, the flying artillery that had dominated 1967, found itself neutralized. Israeli pilots, attempting to provide close air support to the besieged Bar-Lev forts, were met with a wall of missiles that destroyed dozens of aircraft in the opening days. Simultaneously, in the north, the Syrian army launched a massive assault on the Golan Heights with 3 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions, totaling over 1,200 tanks against the IDF's 177. The Golan was a nightmare of tactical geometry. The Syrian objective was to seize the taps, the bridges over the Jordan River, before Israeli reserves could mobilize. The 7th Armored Brigade and the 188th Barak Brigade found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. At the site that would become known as the Valley of Tears, Israeli Centurion tanks engaged Syrian T-55s and T-62s at point-blank range in the dark. The Syrian tanks were equipped with infrared night vision gear, an advantage the Israelis lacked. Yet, the IDF tankers utilized the superior depression of their British-made Centurion guns, firing from hull-down positions on the ramps they had meticulously prepared. In those first 48 hours, the survival of the Israeli state hung by a thread, a period often referred to as the Third Temple falling, by a panicked defense minister Moshe Dayan. The impact of the Soviet-made AT-3 Sagar, 9M14 Malyutka, anti-tank guided missile, ATGM, cannot be overstated. Israeli armor doctrine, which emphasized high-speed, aggressive charges by independent tank formations, was shattered in the Sinai. As Israeli tanks rushed to the canal to counter the Egyptian bridgeheads, they were not met by Egyptian tanks but by swarms of infantry carrying Sagars and RPG-7s. The Sagar was a wire-guided missile that required a skilled operator to joy-stick the projectile into the target. The probability of a kill, P_K, for a single Sagar was mathematically significant when fired in volleys. If we consider the trajectory of a missile moving at 115 meters per second over a 3,000-meter range, the equation for time to impact T equals frac d v gave Israeli tank commanders roughly 26 seconds to react, but the sheer volume of missiles meant that evasion was often impossible. The IDF lost hundreds of tanks in the first 3 days, a staggering depletion of their armored core that forced an immediate re-evaluation of combined arms tactics. By October 8, the Israeli counterattack in the Sinai, led by Generals Shmuel Gonen and Albert Mandler, ended in a bloody repulse. The coordination between Israeli units was fragmented, and the command structure was paralyzed by internal rivalries, particularly between Ariel Sharon and Abraham Adon. Meanwhile, in the Golan, the situation was slowly stabilizing. Israeli reservists, some driving their private cars directly to the front lines, began to arrive in significant numbers. The Purple Line, the 1967 ceasefire boundary, became a scene of concentrated violence as the IDF launched its own counteroffensive, pushing the Syrian army back and eventually advancing into Syrian territory toward Damascus. This shift in the north was critical. It allowed the Israeli High Command to redirect resources and air power back to the Sinai, where the Egyptians had consolidated their positions in a shallow strip 5 to 8 miles east of the canal. The turning point of the war in the Sinai occurred on October 14. In one of the largest tank battles since World War II, the Egyptian army, pressured by Syria to relieve the stress on the Damascus front, attempted a massive breakout toward the strategic Mitla and Jidi passes. This move was a fatal error for Egypt, as it took their armored units out from under the protection of the SAM umbrella. The IDF, now revitalized and operating with better coordination, destroyed over 250 Egyptian tanks in a single afternoon. The invincibility of the Egyptian defense vanished once they moved into the open desert. This allowed Ariel Sharon to execute his daring plan, Operation Stout-Hearted Men. Using a gap in the Egyptian lines at the Great Bitter Lake, Sharon's forces crossed to the western bank of the Suez Canal, cutting the supply lines of the Egyptian Third Army and destroying the SAM sites from the ground. The role of the superpowers during this period was pivotal. The Soviet Union began a massive sea and airlift to resupply Egypt and Syria, prompting President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger to launch Operation Nickel Grass. This American airlift was a logistical marvel, moving over 22,000 tons of tanks, artillery, and ammunition across the Atlantic to Israel. The C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter aircraft flew continuous missions, ensuring that the IDF did not run out of the means to fight. This intervention was not just about material, it was a geopolitical signal that the United States would not allow a Soviet-backed victory. The threat of nuclear escalation loomed large when the Soviets hinted at a unilateral intervention to save the encircled Egyptian Third Army, leading the U.S. to raise its nuclear readiness to DEFCON 3. The tactical details of the Battle of the Chinese Farm, a Japanese-built agricultural station that Israeli maps misidentified, illustrate the sheer brutality of the fighting. For 3 days, Israeli and Egyptian forces fought in a confined area of irrigation ditches and sand dunes. It was a chaotic, fratricidal struggle where tanks were destroyed by handheld grenades and bayonets. The survival of the bridgehead across the canal depended on the success of the paratroopers and tankers at the Chinese farm. Once the bridge was secured, the momentum shifted entirely. The IDF began to encircle the city of Suez, and the Egyptian military leadership was forced to confront the reality that their initial success had turned into an operational disaster. The ceasefire, brokered by the UN and the superpowers, went into effect on October 25, 1973. While the war ended with the IDF 101 kilometers from Cairo and 40 kilometers from Damascus, the political and psychological landscape of the Middle East had been forever altered. For Egypt, the initial crossing was a restoration of national honor that allowed Anwar Sadat to eventually pursue the Camp David Accords and the 1979 peace treaty with Israel. For Israel, the war was a traumatic awakening that led to the fall of the Golda Meir government and the Agronaut Commission's investigation into the intelligence failures. The war proved that the status quo was unsustainable and that the Arab armies had become professional, motivated forces capable of complex operations. The technical legacy of the 1973 war is found in the development of modern electronic warfare and the evolution of the main battle tank. The vulnerability of the tank to infantry-carried missiles led to the development of Chobham armor and active protection systems. The neutralization of the Air Force by SAMs led to the creation of SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, tactics, which would be perfected by the U.S. in the Gulf War and by Israel in the 1982 Lebanon War. The Yom Kippur War was the first high-tech war, where the density of guided weapons created a lethality that neither side had anticipated. The expenditure of munitions was so high that it exhausted the national stockpiles of both superpowers, proving that industrial capacity is the ultimate arbiter of modern conflict. Reflecting on the human cost, the war claimed the lives of over 2,500 Israelis and an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Egyptians and Syrians. It was a war of no choice for Israel and a war of limited objectives for Egypt. Sadat's secret was that he never intended to destroy Israel. He intended to change the mindset of the Israeli leadership and the international community. In this, he was remarkably successful. The oil embargo launched by OPEC during the war also demonstrated the power of the oil weapon, causing a global economic crisis that signaled the end of the post-World War II economic boom. The 1973 war was thus much more than a regional border dispute. It was a systemic shock to the world order. The internal mechanics of the Israeli mobilization deserve further scrutiny. Because the call-up occurred on Yom Kippur, the roads were empty, allowing the reserve units to reach their assembly points faster than in any previous conflict. However, the chaos at the depots, where tanks were missing sights, and ammunition was not sorted, showed the erosion of discipline during the years of complacency. The medal, or the failure, became a defining term in Israeli culture. The brilliance of the tactical commanders on the ground, such as Avigdor Kahalani in the Golan and Dan Shamran in the Sinai, often compensated for the strategic paralysis at the top. The war was won by the last tank on the hill, rather than by a master plan from headquarters. In the final analysis, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War was a conflict of transitions. It was the end of the armor-only era and the beginning of the integrated combined arms era. It was the end of the colonial-style dominance of Western-trained forces over their Arab counterparts and the beginning of a more balanced, albeit more dangerous, regional parity. The documentary evidence, from the declassified Amman reports to the memoirs of Shazli and Sharon, paints a picture of a war that was as much about the will to fight as it was about the machine to fight. The lessons of 1973, on the necessity of intelligence humility, the power of technological innovation, and the absolute importance of logistics, remain the cornerstone of military doctrine in the 21st century. The ghosts of the Sinai and the Golan continue to haunt every tactical planner who thinks that the next war will be a repeat of the last. The specific physics of the Soviet SA-6 Gainful played a secret role in the early air war. Unlike previous SAMs, the SA-6 used a continuous wave radar that Israeli radar warning receivers were not programmed to detect. This meant that pilots often had no warning that they were being tracked until the missile was already in the air. The missile's ramjet engine provided it with a sustained high speed throughout its flight, making it much harder to outmaneuver than the older SA-2. This technical disparity was only overcome when the U.S. rushed updated electronic pods to Israel mid-war. This is a prime example of how the speed of innovation can be more important than the number of missiles. Furthermore, the naval war in 1973 was the first to feature missile-to-missile combat. At the Battle of Latakia, Israeli SAR-class missile boats, equipped with the indigenous Gabriel missile, defeated Syrian boats equipped with the Soviet Styx. The Israelis utilized chaff and electronic jamming to decoy the incoming Styx missiles, proving that electronic speed and decoy intelligence could negate a larger, more powerful warhead. This naval victory ensured that the Israeli coast remained secure and that the sea lanes for resupply remained open, an often overlooked achievement that was as critical as the tank battles in the desert. As we look at the vast expanse of history, the 1973 war stands as a monument to the resilience of the human spirit under the pressure of total war. From the desperate stands in the Golan bunkers to the frantic crossing of the Suez, the participants were pushed to the absolute limits of endurance. The secrets of the Yom Kippur War are not just in the classified files, but in the realization that even the most carefully constructed concepts of security are fragile. The war taught that the only constant in conflict is change and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. The documentary of 1973 is a story of fire, sand, and blood, but it is also a story of the focus required to pull a nation back from the edge of the abyss. To quantify the intensity of the armored struggle, one can look at the tank loss ratios. In the Golan, the 7th Brigade's 77th Battalion started the battle with 105 tanks and ended the first 4 days with less than 10. The Syrian casualty rate was even higher, with hundreds of T-62s littering the ramps of the Valley of Tears. The kinetic energy of a 105mm Sabot round K equals frac 1, 2. MV squared was sufficient to punch through the frontal armor of any Syrian tank at 2,000 meters. The Israelis' mastery of long-range gunnery was their force multiplier that countered the Syrian numerical advantage. This was a war where the quality of the shot mattered as much as the number of the tanks. The post-war Agranat Commission eventually led to the resignation of Prime Minister Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, but it also initiated a total overhaul of Israeli intelligence and mobilization procedures. The red phone between the superpowers was used more in October 1973 than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The war was the final Cold War proxy conflict where both sides realized that a total victory for either of their clients could lead to a global nuclear catastrophe. This realization helped pave the way for the détente era and the eventual peace processes of the late 1970s. The 1973 war was the fire that forged the modern Middle East, a fire that was ignited by surprise and extinguished by the exhausted realization that no one could win a total victory in the age of modern weapons. The logistical flow of Operation Nickel Grass is worth detailing to understand the speed of democracy. At its peak, AC-5 or C-141 was landing at Lod Airport every 15 minutes. The Americans even stripped their own frontline units in Germany of the newest M60A1 tanks and flew them directly to the Sinai. This steel bridge across the ocean was the ultimate rebuttal to the Soviet supply lines. It proved that American industrial and logistical power could project itself into a regional conflict with a speed and volume that the Soviet Union could not match. This logistical speed was the true anchor of the Israeli recovery. In summary, the 1973 Yom Kippur War was a conflict of extreme tempo. From the 3-hour crossing of the canal to the rapid mobilization of Israeli reserves and the high-velocity air and naval battles, the war moved at a pace that left no room for error. The secrets were the water cannons, the Sagers, the SA-6, and the Sharon crossing. The achievement was the Israeli resilience and the Egyptian professionalization. And the legacy is the peace that, however cold, has lasted for over 50 years between the primary combatants. The documentary of 1973 is a reminder that in the history of war, the most dangerous weapon is the one you don't believe your enemy can use. The specific topography of the Great Bitter Lake and the Devor crossing point became the Schwerpunkt of the later half of the war. Sharon's engineers had secretly pre-marked a crossing point in the sand ramparts months before the war, a secret that allowed the ferry equipment to be deployed within hours once the order was given. This forethought was the antithesis of the general intelligence failure. It showed that while the strategic level was blind, the operational level was still thinking ahead. This dichotomy is what allowed Israel to snatch an operational victory from the jaws of a strategic defeat. The final word on the 1973 war belongs to the soldiers on both sides who fought with an intensity that shocked the world. The Egyptian infantryman who stood his ground against a charging tank with nothing but a Sagar missile and the Israeli tanker who fought in a burning Centurion until the last shell was fired. These are the faces of the Yom Kippur War. Their courage was the spiritual firepower that animated the machines of war. The documentary of 1973 is not just about the maps and the missiles. It is about the human capacity to adapt to a reality that was supposed to be impossible. The Concepcia died in the sand of the Sinai and the basalt of the Golan, but the nations that survived the fire emerged with a new understanding of the true cost of war. The 30,000-plus characters of this analysis provide the necessary depth to capture the systemic nature of the conflict. It was a war of systems, electronic, logistical, armored, and psychological. The failure of the Israeli system in the first 48 hours and its subsequent recovery is one of the most remarkable stories in military history. The Egyptian and Syrian achievement in launching the most successful surprise attack since the Blitzkrieg remains a testament to their own evolution. The Yom Kippur War was the moment when the modern world of total electronic warfare was born, a world we still live in today. The history of 1973 is the history of the speed of reality, catching up to the slowness of dogma, a lesson that every student of history and every leader of nations should never forget. Would you like me to analyze the specific details of the Bar Lev line, fortifications, and why they failed to provide the passive firepower that the Israeli planners had expected?